Good evening, everyone. My name is Vanessa Queer Olson. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Research or Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in Overton. Many of you are probably already familiar with me or have participated or joined us for many of these Ag in the Evening programs, and we welcome you once again this evening. Tonight's topic is establishment of perennial pastures and hay meadows. I'm going to focus on our warm season perennials that are primarily utilized in Central and East Texas. If you have a question about a forage that I don't mention, or maybe establishing warm season annual species, I'll be happy to address those. Many of the principles will be very similar. Some differences obviously in seeding rates, planting time potentially, as well as weed control during that establishment year. So please feel free to use the chat if you have any questions this evening. The program is being recorded, so and we can share with you the link to the YouTube page where you can find all of our previous recordings, including this one. I'm not going to be sharing my video this evening. I've been on webinars earlier today and had some internet connectivity issues. And so on my end, I wanted to save us any potential issues, so I will not be sharing my video. Hopefully everyone can see the screen as well as you have good audio and a combination thereof. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, I'm going to talk about establishment of warm season perennials for pasture and hay production. I'm going to focus primarily on Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. I've already received a number of questions this season or a few months ago in advance of this upcoming warm season and anticipating either the desire to replant or establish a new species or a new variety, as well as I think following the extreme cold temperatures, snow and ice in February, many producers were concerned about potentially the need to replant or to reestablish as a result of or concern about having any winter kill. So hopefully you're not in that particular scenario. It's possible you are just trying to expand your education, or you are potentially thinking about replanting, or maybe you've acquired new property you would like to establish for forage production. So first and foremost, of course, anytime we talk about planting anything, if we're going to plant Bermuda grass for the first time or reestablish a field, or even if we're thinking about incorporating cool season annuals such as ryegrass into our pasture systems, we should always start with a soil test. In my experience, lack of soil testing is the #1 cause of poor stands of establishment. We want to know where we start as far as soil fertility, what amendments need to be made to promote or to support that new stand, those seedlings or those sprigs. Any seedlings or sprigs are going to be very sensitive to lack of soil fertility or poor soil fertility, as well as they may be sensitive to low soil pH. And if you happen to be located in an area that has very sandy soils, sand is naturally acidic, so you do run the greater risk of having a soil pH that's entirely too low to support a given forage species or a specific variety. Whenever it comes to fertilizing, we'll talk about that along the way. Phosphorus and potassium are going to be the primary nutrients you would want to focus on with a soil analysis. When you send soil samples to the lab, the paperwork has a selection as far as use. As you're filling out that paperwork, you would select establishment or new planting. Would recommend telling them what species you are planting, as well as even variety if you've made that choice, so they can give you the best recommendations. If you tell them it's a new established field or a to-be established field, they're going to focus on phosphorus and potassium. If you remember from previous discussions on soil fertility, phosphorus is important for root growth and development. We don't necessarily need a lot of phosphorus to produce Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or many of our forages. However, it is very important for root growth and development, which obviously during that establishment year, as you're trying to establish that field, root growth is going to be critical. You want to make sure during that year you are establishing a very deep, solid root structure that can take advantage of additional nutrients that may be available, as well as moisture. And moisture is another big challenge for us in Texas during that establishment season. And it's a challenge for a lot of folks, especially if you don't have irrigation. So we really want to build that root structure as well as possible. So phosphorus will be important. Potassium, of course, as we know for Bermuda grass, is important for persistence. And the great thing about both of those nutrients is they're very immobile. So we can incorporate those nutrients during the seed bed preparation, which actually is a recommendation, is to incorporate those nutrients, especially phosphorus, since it does tend to build up in those top 2 to 3 inches of soil if it's just simply broadcast. So this is our opportunity for a perennial stand during establishment to incorporate those nutrients and have them potentially a little bit deeper in our soils than being very shallow, especially when it comes to phosphorus. Also, if you have a low soil pH, this is a great opportunity to incorporate lime as opposed to waiting for rainfall to incorporate that liming material into your stand. So my recommendation for many of our forage species, ideally we would like to have a soil pH of at least 5. It may be to your advantage even to aim to have a soil pH closer to 5.5 especially for Bermuda grass, depending on the variety, but I think it would behoove most of us to try to aim for that, especially during that establishment season. So we make sure what nutrients are available in our soil, our plants can actually capture and utilize. So soil testing is the first step. So hopefully if you're looking to be in this process, you have already completed that, potentially the fall before planting. That would be my recommendation, to allow for adequate time to make decisions about what you're going to plant, where you're going to plant, as well as opportunity to incorporate those nutrients during that seed bed preparation period, or during that process. So another reason we often see failure of establishment is planting time. Obviously, planting time is going to be highly dependent on several factors: weather, maybe availability of equipment, availability of seed, other issues, other situations that can make establishment very challenging. Last year in 2020, we had a very cool spring and a very wet spring. So a lot of rainfall may keep you out of the field, or cooler temperatures may set you back as far as planting time or delay your planting time. So depending on what you're trying to establish, planting time will be critical. We obviously want to shoot for ideal weather conditions. For most of our warm season perennials, typically mid to late April, early May. We can plant throughout the summer. However, the later you plant, you increase your risk of drought, especially in Texas. And then you also obviously delay that establishment once we start to go into the fall and winter. Now, we do typically have mild winters, so it may not necessarily always be a challenge. But as far as situations like we had in February, we don't want to plant so late in the fall that we are at greater risk for winter kill when situations, sub-zero temperatures do, randomly occur for us. Proper seeding method will be important, and we'll talk about planting method and some recommendations, whether you are sprigging Bermuda grass or you're planting Bermuda grass or Bahia grass by seed, or even native forages. Good seed placement will be critical. When we talk about winter pasture, that's important when we're overseeding our warm season perennials with winter forages. It's also going to be important as we're trying to establish these perennial stands. Seed to soil contact is always important, so that as that seed germinates, you have soil available for roots to actually take hold of, and it's not buried so deep that you're not going to have germination at all. So seed placement can be very important, and so there will be specific recommendations to optimize that seed placement for various species, as well as how deep should sprigs actually be quote unquote buried. Proper seeding rate, that if you are planting a seeded Bermuda grass or a native forage or a Bahia grass, that may be dependent on several factors, may be dependent on the variety that you're planting, whether it's coated or uncoated, hulled or unhulled. And we'll talk about what those mean when we talk about seeding Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. And then, of course, during the establishment year, another large challenge besides weather is going to be weed control and controlling competition. And that's probably the second reason that we often see failure is lack of controlling competition. And we have some options prior to planting, and then depending on what we plant, that will change our potential options during that establishment year. So we'll talk about all of that for our various species. So no matter what we're planting, if we are starting from scratch, obviously a prepared seed bed, we need a well-prepared seed bed. So what does well-prepared actually mean? Obviously, we need to kill all existing vegetation. So if this is a new piece of property, and obviously it's overrun with a sundry of weeds or other grasses that you find undesirable, killing all existing vegetation is step number one. If you are planting a warm season species, I recommend starting that process in the fall. Now, if you haven't already done that, it's not necessarily too late, but that would be my recommendation. To kill all existing vegetation in the fall, 5 to 6 quarts of glyphosate per acre, and that would be a glyphosate product that's about 41.2% glyphosate. That may be Roundup or another trade name product. So you want to kill all existing vegetation. At that time period, you could then create a prepared seed bed by plowing, disking, and finishing. And then instead of letting that land lay fallow all winter, you could come in and overseed with ryegrass or a small grain and still utilize that pasture for grazing. Or if it's going to be a hay meadow, you could potentially harvest some forage, or if it's feasible, you could graze it as well. So then your land's not laying fallow. Once again in spring, we're going to come back and kill all existing vegetation again, ryegrass or not, with 5 to 6 quarts of glyphosate per acre. Now, an advantage to two herbicide applications, that helps to reduce some of your competition. Now, it's not going to eliminate all of your potential competition, but it does give you an advantage. The other advantage to that process by planting a cool season forage, when we have actively growing vegetation, that helps to outcompete other seeds from germinating. You will probably often notice when you do overseed your pastures with winter forages, you likely have fewer winter weeds, less henbit, less groundsel, less winter grasses potentially that are, undesirable, such as little barley, what have you. So that's another advantage of actually planting into that prepared seed bed in the fall, because we have actively growing vegetation that can help reduce some weed pressure at the beginning of that establishment phase. So once we've come to the springtime, mid to late April, early May, really depending on our weather and temperatures, you want to plow, disc, and then finish at least 2 to 4 weeks prior to sprigging or prior to seeding. During that preparation time, like I mentioned earlier, you can incorporate any nutrients. Strictly, I would only recommend incorporating lime, phosphorus, and potassium. If you applied any nitrogen at that time, any weeds that germinate, because they will likely germinate faster than any seeds and likely germinate as well, as opposed to those Bermuda grass sprigs actually using that nitrogen. So we want to delay that nitrogen application until we actually have growth, and we'll talk about when that is specifically. You will want to allow time to settle, or you may want to firm the seed bed with a cultipacker or a roller. Now, you want it firm, but you don't want it so firm that you could bounce a basketball off of it. You do want to make sure you want it soft enough you can have good seed to soil contact, as well as good sprig to soil coverage. So a good measure of what's an appropriate firmness versus softness is that your boot tracks should be about 1/4 of an inch deep. So here's a good visual of that. So it's firm enough, but not so firm that you're not going to have some, or be able to have some seed to soil contact as after you've planted seeds or sprigs. So just keep that in mind. You still need a firm seed bed, but you don't want it so firm that you could bounce a volleyball off of it, like I said. So as far as establishing hybrid Bermuda grass varieties, so that's several different varieties. Most commonly in Texas would be Coastal, Tifton 85, or Jigs Bermuda grass. Others you may be familiar with, or you may even have, would be Tifton 44, Alicia, Russell. Those are other hybrid varieties of Bermuda grass that have to be established by vegetative material. Now you may see that they produce a seed head, but they do not produce viable seed that can then be used for establishment. So absolutely have to be established by plant material. So there's a couple of methods of quote unquote sprigging or establishing hybrid Bermuda grass. Dormant sprigs or rhizomes. So you have root material as well as leaf material. Dormant sprigs can be established. I only recommend this method with coastal Bermuda grass. Some producers will plant dormant sprigs just to try to capitalize on some of that much earlier spring moisture. Now, obviously, for us during that January to March time period in East Texas, often we do have more moisture, which we could capitalize on, but could also make it challenge as far as harvesting sprigs and then getting them planted. So that is an option. You will notice the planting rate for dormant sprigs is much higher because your survival is going to be, you have a higher risk of not some of those sprigs not surviving. So we would recommend sprigging at a little bit higher as far as bushels per acre. Second, which is probably more common, especially for Tifton 85 as well as coastal or even jigs, would be sprigs with green tops. So rhizomes along with some green plant material at 30 to 50 bushels per acre. The recommendation is anytime after our last freeze up until August. Obviously, sprigs are typically not dug, of course, until they have broken dormancy, and then typically once they start actively growing. So that can vary as far as time because their growth will be dependent on our night temperatures. So our soil temperatures need to be 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So our night temperatures typically need to be 55 degrees or higher consistently. Even in the past couple of weeks, we've had some evenings where we've dipped down into 30 or been in the 40s. So we're still, hopefully at this point, I think for at least for the next several days, we're going to be fairly warm as far as our night temperatures. So it will depend on whom you're getting your sprigs from, when they dig their sprigs. So that will influence your timing for establishment. So I do recommend, much earlier on, especially maybe as you're collecting your soil samples, locating someone for sprigs and or the sprigging process to actually distribute your sprigs. So locating those people earlier, getting on their list as soon as possible, it would definitely be a recommendation. A third method would be planting tops. You may have heard of this, and this is a frequent question about establishing tops. I would only recommend this with jigs Bermuda grass. Remember, jigs is better adapted to poorly drained locations. So I feel like we have more success with planting jigs as top material or green stems because we are planting in areas that are higher moisture and so less risky as opposed to trying to establish Tifton 85 or coastal by tops into a well-drained location. So obviously, anytime you have green material, that can be achieved. Now, many people have had success using bales of hay as far as establishing. I think this has historically, anecdotally, been successful when used to fill in maybe some thinning areas or some areas that have died from hay feeding or various things, as opposed to establishing an entire field from spreading, say, Bermuda grass hay to try to get that established. So obviously, none of these methods are going to be successful unless you have killed existing vegetation and you have a well-prepared seed bed. So just to provide some visuals, if anyone's not familiar, this is some equipment. This is a sprig planter. This is a Bermuda King. Many spriggers, people who sell sprigs and will actually plant for you, this is often the equipment they are using. These are some pictures from when I was in graduate school at the University of Georgia, and we were converting a field to Tifton 85. So that's Tifton 85. You can see the very sandy loam soils there in South Georgia. So once the sprigs are dug, loaded into a wagon is then attached behind the sprigger, the Bermuda King, and those sprigs are tossed, and it's basically a conveyor belt that moves those sprigs and then drops them behind cutter wheels and then there's wheels to help kind of increase coverage of those sprigs. Now, even after that's done, we do recommend rolling or still packing to help increase seed to sprig form coverage. You don't want those sprigs planted any deeper than about 3 inches, but you do want to make sure you have some soil coverage. And oftentimes, some of those sprigs will still have some root exposure. So going back over with either a tractor, just with some tractor tires, or a roller to help ensure that you have some good soil coverage. So as far as weed control for establishment for sprig Bermuda grass, we have a few more options. We have one pre-emergent herbicide that is labeled for the establishment of sprigged Bermuda grass. So Tifton 85, Jigs, or Coastal, or any of the other hybrid varieties. Diuron 4L or Diurex absolutely cannot be used on seeded Bermuda grass, and it is not labeled for seeded Bermuda grass, and it is not labeled for established stands. So you have a short window of opportunity. Needs to be applied after the grass is sprigged before it actually starts emerging, starts growing. So I typically recommend within about 3 to 4 days of sprigging that you make the application of Diuron 4L. Because it is a pre-emergent product, there are no recommendations on the label for any adjuvants such as a surfactant. That's a question I received earlier, because it is a pre-emergent. It is very effective at controlling many of our annual grasses such as crabgrass, sandbur, ryegrass, as well as many broadleaf weeds. So it is primarily a pre-emergent. So highly recommend utilizing Diuron on a newly sprigged field within the matter of a couple of days. As far as broadleaf weed control, that can be achieved with many of our commonly used herbicides. 2,4-D and dicamba Weedmaster can be effectively used as a post-emergent option. There are other products. It is very critical that you read the labels for those products in regards to timing for during that establishment process. Many of them, they want obviously that Bermuda grass to have tiller to start to spread and to start to peg down at multiple nodes along that stem or along that sprig before using some of those products. So you want to be very mindful of that. I do have a publication on my Forage Facts website with some more details on herbicides for newly sprigged Bermuda grass. You may find that very helpful. Always refer to the label for additional information to use during that establishment year. Now, there are some products such as Pastora that absolutely says do not, your Bermuda grass has to be established. So Pastora is not recommended for use on a newly established field. Nicosulfuron is an active ingredient in Pastora, and it can temporarily stunt Bermuda grass growth, even on an established field. So we do not want that kind of impact on a newly established field. So please refer to the label on those products as you make a selection on what herbicides you use for broadleaf weed control. If herbicides cannot be used, there are a couple of options. You can potentially mow the area to basically remove the top growth of the weeds to help prevent it from producing seed, as well as to help prevent those weeds from shading those Bermuda grass sprigs. However, you do need to be advised that if you have a very dense or a very large, thick canopy of weeds, you have to be mindful if you do mow them, you do not want to produce so much mulch that mulch buries part of your sprigs and then inhibits the sprigging or the tillering and the spreading of that Bermuda grass. So you will need to be mindful of the density and the size of those populations before you select mowing as an option. This is one of those rare times that I recommend mowing for weed control is during that establishment season. It can be a tool that we can use during this time period. Another option could be flash grazing. If the weeds are palatable to cattle, so if you had something like crabgrass, maybe your Diuron, you didn't get the application made timely enough, or you had some escapes, something like crabgrass could easily be flash grazed. You do have to watch your cattle carefully to make sure that they're not uprooting or trampling those Bermuda grass plants. So this is not something where you would turn several animals into the field and then go on vacation for the weekend. This is something you need to be monitoring while they are out there and prepared to move them quickly if needed. And likely they're probably, if you're using flash grazing for some palatable weeds, you probably don't have enough that they're going to be able to stay in there very long without them starting to cause damage to your Bermuda grass, because they're going to have a limited feed source. So you will need to be prepared to move them rather quickly if you decide to use that as an option. All right, for establishing Bermuda grass seed. So oftentimes seeding may be cheaper. It will depend on the year as far as seed prices. Keep in mind that seed prices is often dependent on weather and circumstances in other states. So for us, Bermuda grass seed, most of our processors are in California and Arizona. As far as Bahia grass seed, most of our supply comes out of Georgia and Florida. So weather in those environments for previous years, as well as other situations, can influence prices. So this year, Bermuda and Bahia grass prices are both up from previous years because of weather during the growing season in Georgia and Florida, as well as, unfortunately, some processors in California and Arizona for Bermuda grass have run out of seed. So you will notice seed prices are a little bit higher maybe than previous years. So I had a producer that did some price checking, did some comparison of sprigging versus seeding, and he found sprigging was going to be cheaper as opposed to seeding, primarily because of those seed prices. And he found an available sprigger with some reasonable prices on Sprigs, as well as actually sprigging. That is something I want to address very quickly on sprigging. If you hire someone to sprig for you, if you're buying sprigs from them, and then you're going to hire them for actually sprigging, the cost will vary. On average, coastal Bermuda grass sprigs are typically $3 to $4 a bushel. Tipton 85 is often going to be $4 to $5 a bushel, or just a tick higher, maybe $1 or $2 higher than coastal Bermuda grass. I'm not sure on Jigs Bermuda grass. I haven't priced those sprigs in the past. And as far as what they charge for the actual process will probably depend on how much work they actually have to do. So the more that you can do yourself, the cheaper that will cost you. Obviously, if they have to come in and do the seed bed preparation and the planting, that's going to increase your cost. If you can have the seed bed prepared and all they have to do is come in and plant, that can reduce some of your costs. If you don't want to hire someone to plant sprigs for you, you can use a manure spreader. If you have access to one of those, or you can rent one of those, do keep in mind, do remember, if you are planting green sprigs or even tops, those need to be planted immediately. If you're not going to plant sprigs immediately, they need to be kept fairly moist without so wet that they start to mold and mildew. And they need to be protected so that they don't dry out or potentially get too hot and kind of dry out as well. So I do recommend, if you're buying sprigs and planting yourself, you do it fairly immediately. Do not delay. It will decrease the survivability of your sprigs. Tops are going to be much more sensitive, so they would need to be planted fairly immediately. The other thing that will influence cost is distance. Many spriggers, people who actually sell sprigs and sprig for you for a fee, sometimes how they are going to have a minimal number of acres that they want to sprig. It may be 10 acres, it may be 20 acres. It will just depend, and it may also depend on the distance they're having to travel. Often having to move multiple pieces of equipment or heavy pieces of equipment, which becomes challenging for them as well. So several things to think about. I do try to keep a list of spriggers in Central and East Texas. I'm happy to share. I have agreements from them as far as sharing their contact information. If you happen to be someone who sells or sprigs and would like to be added to the list, or want to be sure that you're on that list, just reach out to me. This is not something that I post on my website. I do share it with county agents and anyone who requests that information. I don't want to necessarily post it on a website for public information per se, but I'm happy to share that. So back to seeding, as far as establishing Bermuda grass seed, a couple of terms I wanted to go over. Bermuda grass seed may be coated or uncoated. The coatings are usually a combination of maybe some fertilizers and fungicides, which can be advantageous and can help for seed survivability. Unfortunately, the coating also frequently will double the weight of the seed. So therefore, your seeding rate would need to be doubled if you are using coated seed. Now, if you are buying a seeded product from, say, Pennington Seed, or I'm sure even East Texas Seed, they will give you a seeding rate based on whether that seed is coated or uncoated, as well as whether it's hulled or unhulled. So hulled and unhulled, I always have to look back at the definition for these because to me, it's almost I think the definitions would be opposite, or maybe not. It just depends on how I'm thinking that day. But hulled seed have part of the seed coating removed, so they've been hulled, so to speak, so that germination is sped up, so they'll germinate a little bit faster. Most Bermuda grass seed is going to be hulled. Unhulled seed still have the seed coats, so that coat has not been removed. So some of that seed will not germinate as quickly. When you would plant unhulled seed, it would be recommended if conditions are not ideal for germination. So that may be if you're planting later in the season. Some people will plant unhulled Bermuda grass seed in the fall, as opposed to, maybe when they're putting out ryegrass seed or something else, as opposed to waiting and planting hulled in the spring, kind of depending on that timing. There are some Bermuda grass seed products that may have a combination of both, so that if there are any issues during that establishment season, hopefully your unhulled would survive. Say if we had a drought or some other weather issues, that could potentially, you just have delayed germination of that seed, but hopefully still have some survivability. Once again, creating a prepared seed bed, disc the field, plow disc until it is a clean prepared seed bed, cultipack the field to firm. You would then broadcast the seed, and then you could follow once again with a cultipacker to press the seed into the soil. Now, if you were going to be using a brilliant seeder, that could be used as opposed to steps. That would basically, a brilliant seeder basically combines steps 2 to 4. So that would reduce the number of trips across your field. So if you have a brilliant seeder, that could be an option. Some people, or in some situations, a harrow can be used in place of a cultipacker, but it generally does not work as well as a cultipacker. So just keep that in mind. You may have a harrow on hand, so it may be a bit easier based on what you already have, but it doesn't necessarily work as well as a cultipacker. So if you have an opportunity, use that cultipacker instead, or a brilliant seeder. So as far as advantages and disadvantages of sprigging and seeding Bermuda grass, some advantages of sprigging: hybrid varieties are generally higher yielding. Sprig Bermuda grass can be treated with diuron 4L for those annual grassy weeds during that establishment year. So that's definitely an advantage. Sprig varieties usually have a more upright growth habit that gives them an advantage as far as hay production, as producing a hay product. And a lot of our livestock consumers are looking for hybrid Bermuda grass hay, whether it's coastal or Tifton 85. So your market may influence if you are in hay production business, your market may influence which you decide to plant. Some disadvantage of sprigging: at times it is more expensive to establish a stand from Sprigs. Once again, that will depend on your source of Sprigs, your planting, whether someone's planting for you or you're doing it yourself, as well as the distance someone's having to travel. So it could potentially be cheaper, but I would recommend doing a cost comparison before you make a definitive decision. Unless you are looking to primarily produce hay, then I would definitely lean towards the hybrid varieties. Obviously, specialized equipment is needed. If it's not something you already own, you may have to rent or borrow or hire someone to to actually plant those sprigs. Coverage is sometimes slower since there are initially fewer plants per square foot. So you do have the advantage of already having roots and green plant material, but coverage can sometimes be slower depending on weather conditions because you do have fewer plants. This is a picture of a brilliant cedar for any of those that, if you're not familiar with what a brilliant cedar looks like. Advantages of seeding: it is usually cheaper to establish seeded Bermuda grass. Depending on seed prices, like I said, this year, with some cost comparisons, it's been more expensive. So seed is a little bit expensive this year for both Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. If high yield is not a large factor, seeding is a good method. Seeded Bermuda grass is an excellent option for grazing livestock, whether it's common or any of the other varieties. And stand establishment may be faster compared to sprigging. Some disadvantages: seeded varieties are usually lower yielding than hybrid varieties, and then control of grassy weeds during the establishment year is much more difficult because we have no pre-emergent products. You would definitely have to resort to mowing potentially, or if they are substantially taller than the seedlings, you could use a weed wiper with glyphosate to try to remove or reduce some of that pressure, or flash grazing depending on the grassy weed. If it's crabgrass, it will work fairly effectively. So for those that might be interested in establishing Bahia grass, I'll probably get more questions about controlling Bahia grass, but Bahia grass is a viable forage for livestock, especially for a pasture situation. It's well adapted to East Texas. It's not nearly as drought tolerant as Bermuda grass, but it is a prolific seed producer, so you're not likely to lose an entire stand during drought conditions. Of course, we do recommend starting with a soil test. Phosphorus and potassium and our soil pH can still be critical during that establishment year, even though Bahia grass will often persist on lower nutrients or lower inputs or fewer inputs. Recommendation is to plant between April 1st and June 1st. Average seeding rate is about 15 pounds of pure live seed per acre. Can be planted in the summer and the fall, but of course, with warmer temperatures and potentially drought conditions, it does increase your risk of failure or poor establishment. Apply 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre after the grass emerges and begins to cover. And that would be the same recommendation on Bermuda grass, whether it's sprigs or seedlings. You want to make sure those seedlings have germinated and started to actively grow before applying any nitrogen. And on the sprigs, you want to make sure that the nodes, I think the second node, first or second node, are actually starting to root from those sprigs. So you're starting to get tillering. Those sprigs are starting to spread before you apply any nitrogen. Weed control in Bahia grass will also be challenging because Bahia grass is going to be sensitive to glyphosate. You can use mowing to reduce some grassy weed control as long as you are not going to be creating a kind of a dense mat that can outcompete those seedlings or cover any seedlings. 2,4-D can be used to control broadleaf weeds as long as your Bahia grass is about or greater than 4 to 5 inches tall. So well within that year, you can use things like 2,4-D Weedmaster, which is 2,4-D and dicamba, safely once you have some growth on that Bahia grass during that establishment year. So in case anyone on here has interest in native grasses, I do often get questions about establishing natives in Central and East Texas. Just as a reminder, our native grasses would be big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, grama grass. I think I said Indian grass, switchgrass. Make sure I remember all of them. That are native to Texas. As far as in East Texas, switchgrass, Indian grass, our blue stems, little and big blue stem would grow as well in East Texas. We don't tend to see as many native grasses in East Texas because our introduced species such as Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Johnson grass, etc., do very well in East Texas with our higher rainfall and well-drained soils. but there may still be some interest. If you are establishing native species, I do recommend planting a combination, not planting one cultivar, so not creating a monoculture, so not planting just little blue stem, planting a combination of species, especially if you are looking to support wildlife, small birds and mammals for nesting and food, as well as to really create what a native pasture would be. It would not necessarily be a monoculture, be a combination of grasses as well as forbs. There are some native forbs that could be added into a stand if you're looking for establishing natives. Do keep in mind, as far as utilization by livestock, does require much more focused pasture management. We can overgraze those natives very quickly because their growth point is a little bit higher on the stem. So they were not going to tolerate the close continuous grazing that our introduced species such as Bermuda grass and Bahia grass will. As far as converting pastures to natives, first you want to be familiar with the location, collect soil samples as far as nutrient availability and soil pH status, but also be familiar with your soil type, whether it's a well-drained or poorly drained location, so you can match the best species for your location and look at multiple species, as I mentioned. You would have to kill all existing vegetation. That would be critical for establishment of a new warm season perennial, including natives. Locate and purchase seed. There are some retailers in Texas, MBS Seed in Denton, Turner Seed in Breckenridge, and there's also a Texas Native Seed. They are further south. So there are multiple sources for native grass seed. If you are interested, and I can provide or point you in those directions so you can locate or determine what seed is available. Obviously, if you have Bermuda grass, you're definitely going to need to apply glyphosate at 5 to 6 quarts per acre. And if you are looking to establish natives, I would definitely recommend making 2 applications on any Bermuda grass in the fall and then once again in the spring. So if you've ever tried to kill Bermuda grass in a garden or a flower bed, you should realize how persistent it is. A lot of people are afraid to even spray a pint of glyphosate over established Bermuda grass for the fear of killing that Bermuda grass. But even for, if you're trying to control it in a flower bed or a garden, it's very challenging. It's very persistent. So if you are looking to get rid of Bermuda grass for the purpose of supporting native forages, you would absolutely need likely 2 applications, fall and then once again in the spring, to really reduce that competition, because Bermuda grass is pretty tough. Like I said, I do recommend a mix of native forages as opposed to a pure stand. Seed could be no-till drilled into a dead side if you have sprayed glyphosate and taken out any Bermuda grass. And then 2 weeks after that, 2 weeks after that glyphosate, that second glyphosate application, you could no-till drill into that dead side or disc and broadcast the seed. Most of our native seeds are very small and very light, so they tend to need to be planted with some sort of carrier, such as some sand, something to help with more even distribution of that seed. And I think even with sand, it can still be a little bit challenging. Very critical, you'll need to exclude the newly planted area from grazing for at least 2 non-drought growing seasons. Now, that is one advantage with our introduced species such as Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. If we have good weather conditions, good growing conditions, and minimal competition during that establishment season, we can potentially graze or harvest that Bermuda grass or Bahia grass the fall of that establishment year. Now, that is not a guarantee. Like I said, it will really depend on weather and fertility and weed competition as to whether you'd be able to achieve that or not. But you'll definitely have to wait at least 2 non-drought growing seasons for establishment of native species. So they do take longer to establish compared to our introduced species. So you just have to keep that in mind and not expect the fast establishment that you might see with Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. There are a lot of factors that will affect native establishment, selection, matching forage species to your location, which that can impact establishment success even with our introduced species. Even within Bermuda grass, Tifton 85 and coastal are better adapted to well-drained locations, whereas Jig's Bermuda grass is better adapted to poorly drained locations. So you do need to make sure you are matching the species to your location, whether your soils are well-drained, poorly drained, as well as your soil type. If you have very heavy clay soils or if you have very sandy soils, our forage species can be somewhat site-specific. Planting technique, planting time. Planting time will be important to capitalize on moisture, as well as have temperatures warm enough to promote germination of that seed and growth. Seeding rate will be important. Obviously, you can increase your seeding rate to increase your success. However, that does increase your cost potentially. Site preparation, reducing competition will be critical for any establishment of any warm season perennial. And then make sure you are purchasing quality seed. You are buying from a reputable dealer. Pay attention to pure live seed percentage on those bags. We do have a seed law in Texas, so all seed has to have a seed tag. Look for the percentage of pure live seed, as well as look for any noxious weed seed that might be in that bag of seed. You want to avoid any noxious weeds, as well as you want a fairly high pure live seed percentage. And then obviously soil moisture. So we'd like to plant when we do have soil moisture or a good chance for some continued soil moisture. Just some different, some seeding recommendations for our warm season native grass species. If you have interest in other, maybe some forbs, some native forbs, I can locate that information for you as far as seeding rates and what might be most successful in East Texas. Obviously, depending on what your goal for establishing these natives can influence your seeding rate recommendation. These are very small seeded, so planting depth is fairly shallow. So planting depth will have an impact on germination of these native species. So with that, just want to remind you a few things as far as major things to think about whenever it comes to establishing any warm season perennials. Make sure you are soil testing to begin with, incorporating lime, phosphorus, or potassium that will be needed to support that specific forage species, as well as selecting the forage species that is adapted to your location, to your soil type, as well as your ranch goals. Whether you are trying to produce hay, you're only trying to grow forage for pasture, or you're interested in supporting wildlife with some native species and supporting some small mammals and birds specifically. So make sure you're matching that to your location as well as your goals. So seed bed preparation will be critical for success. So eliminate, reduce any competition prior to planting. Make sure you are planting at the appropriate depth based on the seed or the sprigs, and that you have purchased located good or high quality seed, as well as viable sprigs, that you're planting them very quickly if they've recently been dug, so that you increase your success for establishment. As far as weed control during that establishment year, a couple of options we've talked about, so we'll mention them briefly again. Obviously, taking care of some competition beforehand with glyphosate prior to creating that prepared seed bed can really help reduce some of that potential competition. Mentioned mowing. Obviously, this is one time I do recommend mowing as a weed control method, especially as those weeds get taller, and especially whenever it comes to grassy weeds, whether you have established a seeded Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or even sprigged Bermuda grass. You can use mowing, can be effective to help reduce some of that competition. But make sure you don't have such a dense weed population that you're creating a lot of kind of mulch that can outcompete seedlings or sprigs potentially. Remember, with any herbicide use, with Diuron or any post-emergent products, make sure you are following the label directions as far as timing. This is going to be very critical during that establishment year. Read those labels, especially on many of those post-emergent products, to make sure that it is safe during the establishment year on your Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, as well as the timing. What stage of growth does that Bermuda grass or Bahia grass need to be at for it to be safe to use that particular product? 2,4-D will be safe as a post-emergent at any point during that season, but we can get some perennial weeds where we might need something a little bit stronger potentially. So make sure you are reading those labels as far as if that product is safe, what's the recommended rate, as well as timing during that establishment season. So I think I saw chat come up. So there is a question. I'll go ahead and address it. The question is, what is the status of alfalfa in East Texas? So Dr. Vince Habe is a retired soil scientist from Overton. He did a lot of research in East Texas on where in East Texas we can grow alfalfa. He has some excellent publications and information that he put together years ago that is still very viable. My recommendation, I'd be happy to share that information with you. Alfalfa is very site specific. So in East Texas, our biggest concerns or limitations for growing alfalfa is soil pH, so soil acidity, and not just at the 6-inch depth. Alfalfa is a perennial legume and it produces a very large taproot and it can go very deep into our soil profile. So our soil pH at 5 to 6 feet is almost more important than our soil pH just at 6 inches. So knowing a deeper soil pH, and that can be a challenge for many of us in East Texas, is those very acidic soils. You need a well-drained location, but a soil that will still hold some moisture. Obviously, you need moisture for plant growth and persistence of any perennial, but you don't need a flooded or poorly drained location. Alfalfa is not going to do very well in that environment. Another concern in East Texas is cotton root rot. So knowing the history of your property as far as what crops had been previously grown can be a limitation or a concern, really depending on where you are in East Texas. There are some producers in East Texas that have grown alfalfa. My recommendation, once again, like I said, is to do some research to use the web soil survey to determine your soil types on your property. I'm happy to help you to look through the information that Dr. Habe has put together as far as what soils in East Texas we can grow alfalfa in. So that's the first step before you ever buy any seed or commit to the process, is just determining if the soils on your property will even grow alfalfa. If you do not have the appropriate soils, it's not worth your time and investment to continue that process. And I can help you with that, walking through the web soil survey and Dr. Habe's information. That information can be found on the Overton website, but I'm happy to send you copies if that is desirable. Several years ago, we had a conference in Overton on alfalfa in East Texas. I still have a few of those handbooks. If you are interested in one of those, it goes through a lot of information about alfalfa production as far as insect diseases, harvesting or grazing, a lot of information on alfalfa production and the potential in East Texas. I'm happy to mail you a copy of one of those if you have interest. Just send me an email and I'll be happy to share that with you.
Hey, Vanessa,
yes.
This is Jacob, and I've got kind of a specialty question. You can tell me to hush if that's what we need to do.
Okay.
But talking about alfalfa, some of my guys that have figured out that alfalfa is not going to grow in Woodville have taken an interest in peanut grass. Do you know anything about the closest we've found peanut grass has been eastern Louisiana? Do you know of any closer folks, or do you want to talk about this later?
Okay, so are you talking about perennial peanuts?
Yes, ma'am. Perennial peanut.
Okay. So perennial peanuts are a legume. They're highly utilized, especially in Florida, and through the Southeast, probably much more so in Florida, potentially in some locations in Louisiana. There was a producer in kind of around the Beaumont area that has been successful with perennial peanut. It is a plant, it is a legume that has to be planted from vegetative material. So that is the biggest challenge, is getting vegetative material, a source of vegetative material. So there was a gentleman, I would have to look, I'm pretty sure I have his contact information written down. I don't know it off the top of my head, who has been successful kind of in the Beaumont area with perennial peanut.
Well,
Probably our biggest.
Yeah, I've got one guy that's been successful, but he doesn't want to share just yet.
Oh, okay. Well, that can be a challenge. He may still be trying to get established, and then it may take some convincing. He may potentially start a nursery and then be willing to share some sprigs. I've tried to establish perennial peanut in Overton, had failure due to drought. So that is probably one of our biggest challenges, is drought. But that is something. And then also cold tolerance. Perennial peanut for me is not very cold tolerant. So I would say any potential for perennial peanut would likely be south of Waco. There was a variety out that did very well in the Stephenville area that was a little bit more cold tolerant. I think it's latitude 42, or I may have the wrong name. But the biggest challenge will likely be finding plant material for many folks, but that could be an option. And that is also a perennial legume. That's a warm season perennial legume. So back to weed control during establishment year. You can potentially do some individual plant treatment or some spot treatments depending on your weed populations, whether you're using glyphosate on some grasses or some broadleaf herbicides. Most of us would be doing a broadcast application. Just make sure you are reading those labels and following recommendations as far as timing during that establishment season, so we're not causing damage potentially to those newly established sprigs or seeds. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions about establishment or any other forage questions as well. I do want to let you know, as far as some upcoming, or the next upcoming Ag in the Evening, that would be on May 11th. Of course, Dr. Jason Banta, he will be covering the question, how much forage do I need? As far as, and really focusing on stocking rates as far as determining hay needs. How much hay do you actually need? So that's a good thing to talk about here kind of at the beginning of the season, as you start moving forward through the summer and making plans even as you move into the winter as well. So excellent opportunity for additional information that Dr. Banta will be covering on May 11th. Look for emails, or through your emails, you may have received an email from your county agent with the links to register. You can also find this flyer on my Forage Facts website, which would have the active link to register for that program on May 11th. Forage Facts is also an excellent resource for additional information on a variety of topics, especially the publication on herbicides or weed control on newly sprigged Bermuda grass. That can be found under publications. If you are looking or would like some more alfalfa information, please email me. My contact information can be found on Forage Facts. I'm happy to help you through that process on determining if your property can support alfalfa, and look at the pros and cons, and etc. So I'm always happy to help. We appreciate you joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you in the future in face-to-face events, but we also hope to see you in the future as we continue with our Ag in the Evening program, at least for the foreseeable future at the moment. So But I'm happy to answer any questions. If not, I hope everyone has a great evening.